Eleanor's hands, worn from years of love and labor, moved through the soil with practiced grace. The scent of damp earth mixed with the faint perfume of blooming roses, a scent that carried memories, whispers of the past, of love that once walked these garden paths beside her. This was not just a collection of flowers and greenery. This was his garden. Every petal, every leaf, every carefully arranged stone was a tribute to the man she had loved for over 40 years. Before illness took him, he had spent countless mornings tending to these very same plants, humming old songs under his breath, his laughter mingling with the rustling leaves. And now, even in his absence, Eleanor kept his legacy alive, waking at dawn to nurture their shared paradise, her only companion the gentle morning breeze. She didn't need much from the world anymore, just this. Just the quiet satisfaction of watching nature thrive under her care, the sun warming her back, and the knowledge that love, even when it outlives a person, can still bloom. The neighbors often admired her work. They'd pass by and nod, some stopping to compliment the riot of colors bursting from the soil, others simply inhaling deeply as they walked, drinking in the peace Eleanor had cultivated so carefully. But not all admired in silence. Some, like Margaret, the self-important president of the HOA, viewed Eleanor's work not as something to be cherished but as something to be used. And Eleanor, though strong in spirit, was about to learn that some people have no respect for things built from love. Margaret was the kind of woman who believed power was her birthright. She held her position as HOA president like a queen clutching a scepter, using rules and fines as weapons against those she deemed unworthy of her pristine suburban empire. To Margaret, appearances were everything. The freshly painted fences, the neatly trimmed hedges, the uniform mailboxes, all carefully dictated by her vision of perfection. And Eleanor? Eleanor, with her wild garden and independent spirit, was a thorn in Margaret's side. She didn't break any actual HOA rules, but she was different, and in Margaret's world, different was dangerous. At first, it was small things, a passive-aggressive remark about how messy natural landscaping looked, a suggestion that Eleanor should consider a more structured arrangement. Eleanor had smiled politely, unwilling to engage in a battle over something so trivial. But then the real overreach began. Margaret took it upon herself to install a brand new community garden in the neighborhood's common area, a sterile, picture-perfect showcase that looked more like a prop than something actually meant to be touched. And to maintain it, she needed water. Lots of it. The problem? The HOA hadn't approved additional plumbing. The solution? Eleanor's hose. Margaret didn't bother asking for permission. Why should she? In her mind, Eleanor was just an old woman with too much time on her hands. If anything, she should be grateful to contribute to the community's aesthetics. So she simply helped herself, marching into Eleanor's yard whenever she pleased, turning the spigot, and dragging the hose across the street to feed her pet project. At first, Eleanor thought it was a mistake, a one-time oversight. But as the days passed and she found her hose lying carelessly in the grass more and more often, the sinking realization hit her. Margaret wasn't taking without asking. She wasn't even considering the idea of asking. Because in Margaret's mind, she wasn't stealing. She was entitled. Eleanor stood at the edge of her garden, staring at the hose sprawled across her lawn, the nozzle dripping onto her soil like a slow insult. Her stomach twisted. She had seen Margaret waltz into her yard that morning, her perfectly manicured hands twisting the spigot without a second thought, her expensive sandals kicking up Eleanor's carefully laid mulch. There hadn't even been a glance toward the house, no pause to consider whether Eleanor might be watching. And that was what stung the most, not just the act itself, but the complete disregard. The expectation that she wouldn't mind. Or worse, that she wouldn't dare say anything. The first time Eleanor confronted her, she had kept her voice calm, respectful. She had asked, gently, if Margaret would please stop using her water without permission. Margaret had blinked at her, then laughed. "Oh, Eleanor," she had said, in that saccharine tone that made Eleanor's blood boil. "It's just a little water. You're not paying for every drop, are you?" Eleanor was paying for every drop. She had lived through times when money was tight, when every cent counted, and the idea of wasting water was unthinkable. And yet, even as she explained this, Margaret had simply waved a dismissive hand and assured her it was for the good of the neighborhood. The next morning, the hose was gone again. Margaret wasn't just ignoring Eleanor's request, she was mocking it. Day after day, Eleanor's patience was tested. The water bill climbed higher, her carefully maintained garden beds suffered from disrupted watering schedules, and worst of all, The feeling of powerlessness settled deep into her bones. She had spent a lifetime being strong, weathering storms, raising children, burying a husband. She had fought through grief and hardship, and yet now, in her own home, she was being made to feel small. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sun sink below the rooftops, a neighbor stopped by. A younger woman, kind-eyed and hesitant. "I saw her again today," she admitted. "I wanted to say something, but—" She trailed off, looking around as if afraid someone might overhear. Eleanor understood. Speaking up against Margaret came with consequences. She had seen what happened to people who challenged her. The sudden HOA violations, the anonymous complaints, the passive-aggressive emails. Eleanor exhaled slowly, gripping the arms of her chair. She had spent so long avoiding conflict, believing that being the bigger person meant enduring disrespect without retaliation. But was silence truly wisdom, or was it surrender? The final straw came when Eleanor knelt beside her late husband's favorite flower bed one morning and found the roses wilting. They had been fine just days before, thriving under her careful touch. But now their leaves were browning at the edges, the soil dry and cracked. The lack of water had taken its toll. Her fingers, so used to tending life, trembled as they traced the brittle stems. A lump formed in her throat. This garden had been his sanctuary. Their sanctuary. Every time she watered these plants, she felt him there beside her. And now, because of Margaret's arrogance, something precious was being stolen from her. Not just water, not just flowers, but respect. Eleanor closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, letting the moment settle deep into her soul. She had been patient. She had been kind. She had asked. And yet, none of it had mattered. Margaret had made it clear. She would not stop unless Eleanor made her. And just like that, something inside her shifted. Margaret had no idea what was coming. Eleanor didn't believe in pointless revenge, but she did believe in lessons. Late that evening, she sat on her porch, watching the neighborhood lights flicker off one by one. The silence gave her clarity. Margaret had stolen her peace, her respect, and even the water meant for her husband's beloved garden. It was time to return the favor, creatively. With steady hands, Eleanor made a few quiet calls to an old friend who worked in waste management. A plan began to form. She wouldn't fight Margaret with anger. No, she would use her own arrogance against her. Meets its new source ****. The next morning, while Margaret was busy parading around the HOA meeting, Eleanor set to work. Instead of connecting the garden hose to her regular spigot, she carefully attached it to a nearby compost tank, one filled with weeks of rotting organic waste, liquefied by summer heat. It wasn't toxic, but it was foul. The kind of smell that lingers. The kind that seeps into fabric and refuses to leave. Then, Eleanor simply waited. The afternoon sun was high when Margaret came strutting into Eleanor's yard, her usual entitled smirk plastered on her face. She didn't even hesitate. Without checking, she turned the hose full blast onto her pristine flower bed, expecting crystal-clear water. Instead, a tidal wave of putrid, sludge-like liquid exploded out, soaking her from head to toe. The entire street heard her scream. Neighbors peeked from their windows. Some gasped. Others, the ones Margaret had bullied for years, had to turn away to hide their laughter. Margaret staggered back, dripping, gagging, her pristine designer clothes ruined. But the worst part? The humiliation. The HOA queen, the woman who lived to control others, had just been publicly taken down by her own arrogance. The very neighbors she had tormented finally saw her powerless. For the first time, Margaret had no control. And Eleanor? She didn't say a word. Just stood there, arms crossed, watching Margaret scramble to save face. The neighbors had seen everything. They knew. And as Margaret stormed off, gagging and humiliated, whispers of rebellion began to stir. Margaret tried to spin the story, claiming Eleanor had sabotaged her. But this time, the neighborhood didn't rally behind her. They had seen too much, endured too much. Her reign of control had cracked, and suddenly, old complaints surfaced. Reports of unfair fines, intimidation, and double standards. By the end of the month, a vote was called. Margaret, for the first time, was outnumbered. She was removed from her HOA position. And Eleanor? She simply smiled, turned back to her garden, and let the flowers bloom in peace. A desperate move ***. Humiliated and seething, Margaret refused to accept defeat. That very night, she marched up to Eleanor's door, fury radiating from her perfectly ironed blouse. She demanded an apology, threatened to fine Eleanor, even hinted at legal action. But Eleanor? She simply sipped her tea, calm as a still lake. "Oh, Margaret," she said, her voice dripping with polite amusement. "It's just a little water. You're not paying for every drop, are you?" The same dismissive words Margaret had once used now cut through the air like a knife. The power had shifted. Margaret realized it too. Against Margaret ***. Word spread fast. Too fast for Margaret to control. Neighbors who had once cowered now found their voices. Stories surfaced. Unfair fines, petty rules, HOA funds suspiciously mismanaged. Eleanor had been their quiet strength. And now, thanks to Margaret's arrogance, they finally had a reason to push back. At the next HOA meeting, the unthinkable happened. Margaret was openly challenged. People demanded transparency, called for a vote of no confidence. For the first time, Margaret had no allies. Margaret gets what she deserves. The vote came swiftly. The once untouchable queen was dethroned. No more fines. No more threats. No more smug superiority. Margaret, once so powerful, stood there speechless as her own system turned against her. She tried to fight it, of course, her face red, her hands shaking, but the decision was final. She was removed as HOA president. Her reign of terror? Over. Margaret refused to let go without one last attempt at control. She tried appealing to local authorities, claiming harassment. But when they investigated, they found Margaret had been the one violating HOA regulations. The result? She was fined. By her own HOA. It was the final, poetic touch to her downfall. With Margaret out of power, the neighborhood changed. The ridiculous rules faded. The oppressive fines stopped. And Eleanor? She finally had her garden untouched, uninterrupted. One morning, she walked through her blooming flowers, feeling the warm sun on her skin. She had never raised her voice. Never sought cruelty. But she had stood her ground. And in the end, respect, patience, and quiet strength had won.